Everybody kind of thinks that they know it, but there is a lot of work that goes into the craft of story building. Understanding the rising and falling action and plot points and pinch points and all of that stuff. And you know, you can sort of get it instinctively if you're around stories, but unless you understand and recognize the pacing of a story, you know, you're not always going to hit it.
Do you feel continually let down by modern media? Do you miss the good old days, back when all that mattered was a good story and not some agenda? Do you have ambitions of picking up a pen and pad and fighting the creative war yourself? Then this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'm going to talk to a creator who said enough is enough and started making the content they wished was out there. Join us as we discuss the ups and downs of the self-publishing world. We want to help empower you to join the Iron Age of media. Welcome to Iron Age Marketing. Welcome everyone to another episode of Iron Age Marketing. I'm Pete here today with Mr. Jason McCuiston. How are we doing today, Jason?
I'm pretty good. It's good to meet you, Nikki.
It's one of my favorite parts about doing this is meeting fellow nerds from around the world.
I am that for sure.
So, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you found your way to this world?
Okay, my name is Jason McCuiston. I'm the author of Project Notebook, the Last Star Warden series of pulp sci-fi adventure, and probably close to 30 stories in other publications. And I started out wanting to be a comic book artist. I guess that's the nutshell version.
So what drew you to comic books and wanting you to be a comic book artist?
Well, as a kid, I grew up in the 70s, and my dad used to have this tub full of old, creepy, eerie Vampirella and Savage Sword of Conan magazines. And I probably was too young to be reading those, but I just loved them, And then I turned them into coloring books because they were in black and white. So, I guess that process sort of led to the visual storytelling. And then from there, it was Marvel all.
It's a very intimate way to get familiar with the art style, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And just for the record, I can't judge. I can't say anything. I read The Dark Half by Stephen King when I was in fourth grade. I was 8 years old or something like that. So, yeah, sometimes we find things when we're going to find them, whether or not we're supposed to.
Yeah, my mom was a huge Stephen King fan. So, I mean, we had that around the house. And when I ran out of comics to read, I would pick up a Stephen King book. I started with the Dark Tower books.
Well, it's funny. That's exactly where I started. It's funny to me that, well, I'm not a big King fan these days because he's kind of crazy on Twitter. He absolutely has an unbridled love and passion for that early era horror comic, like that. The Tales of the Crypt era kind of stuff. That just the classic, and there's a certain man. I wish I could have grown up in that era. Not that I'm complaining. I grew up in the '90s when we had the X-Men TV show, and so we had our own stuff to love. But as a horror person, like I feel like we didn't have much in that realm, and it was just such a dearth of it because of because of what pulp was doing in the 50s.
Yeah, I think where Stephen King, when he's at his strongest is when he's in touch with the pulp roots, because he first started trying to break in writing for magazines like Cavalier, and I've heard it said that he is a pulp writer who aspires to being a literary writer, whereas Gaiman is a literary writer who aspires to be a pulp writer. And I can't remember where I heard that, but I was like, it kind of makes sense,
That is actually really funny. So why don't you tell me a little bit more about, I guess, what you're working on right now and what that looks like?
Well, right now I've got a book coming out next month called "The Brotherhood of Secret Darkness and Other Cults, Cabals, and Conspiracies," and it's a collection of 13 illustrated short stories dealing with cults, cabals, and conspiracy theories. So it's probably going to get suppressed, you know, because it has that bad word conspiracy in it. But
So you mean I've been marketing my other podcast all wrong by making sure it's hashtagged and everything?
yeah, I've got a YouTube video trailer up, but you know how YouTube is, so I probably got to go and see what I can do with that. But that grew out of just well, the way the world has been for the past few years. I was letting it get to me, and it caused a lot of I don't know, angst, and that led to writer's block. And so I figured the best way to take that was to go head on. And so I wrote stories about conspiracy theories, and it became the core of this collection.
So I'm curious when you talk conspiracy theories, are we talking like modern stuff? We talking old classic stuff? Cults and cabals. That starts reminding me like I've got a whole bunch of books on the history of secret societies and stuff back there. I think I saw Dan Brown and was like, "Oh, there's how far does these rabbit holes go? Let's see what's out there." And there's some interesting stuff from time, and whether or not you put any stock into it, there is a lot of history behind the idea. Like, yeah, the Illuminati existed one way or the other. Were they as powerful, or what we think of as the Illuminati? Do they still exist? Who the hell knows?
Yeah, and what are they? I mean, if they do exist.
So, what angle do you attack this from? You kind of get into the history of it, or you're doing more of like a narrative using the societies as a setting kind of thing?
No, it's more of a connective tissue because I'm pretty much hardcore pulp. There's got to be, some kind of adventure of, whether it's the mystery or, the straight up fighting the monster kind of thing. So, uh, you know, like I said, those Savage Sword of Conan, he was always going up against cults here and there, and that's just in my DNA now. So, I've got stories in there about aliens. I've got stories about, pagan gods. I've got stories about secretive cults. I mean, it's all in there as a.
Do you do it from? Do you do? Is it? Do you like it set in modern times, set in history, kind of like a combination of the two?
Well, in this story, yeah, it's kind of all over the place, or this collection of stories. But I'm a history nerd, so a lot of my stories have some historical reference. Like the novel Project Notebook is set in 1947. It's kind of, um, I guess the best way to describe it would be like a noir X Files set at the beginning of the Cold War.
Set in the Cold War, huh?
Yeah, right after World War II.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, the concept, it's like a team of World War II vets are assigned to
Hmm.
investigate the Maury Island incident, and basically everything goes wrong at the beginning, and it's just
See, and this is why I immediately tried to get an episode with you because I saw little nuggets of things like, oh no, I'm gonna love this. This guy's into some cool stuff.
like I said, I just all this stuff goes in and it has to come out.
Out of curiosity, where's your place on Lovecraft?
Oh, I'm a Lovecraft fan. I've got books up here, him and Robert E. Howard. I love the way that they both come at things from opposite angles. There's this round robin story they did where Lovecraft started it, and this guy gets his identity swapped out with an alien, and then when Robert takes it over, instead of the hero becoming a quivering mass of fear, he winds up taking over the planet. And I'm like, well, that's just their identities, in a nutshell, right there.
Now, I'm curious. So was love? When did you kind of come across Lovecraft? Do you find him early on in your kind of becoming, or later in life?
Oddly enough, it was the tabletop role playing game from Chaosium, Call of Cthulhu. I found it in high school, and I played the game for probably years before I actually picked up the first story. And then once I started reading him, I was like, okay, I get it. I see why he has stood the test of time.
There's something he does that many have tried, and few have ever come close to implementing it. And there's a thing that I think he understood that even today, like horror writers, I think we all, maybe it's because we all become too precious with like our ideas and what we do, that we somehow think that we're different, and that, oh well, the monster in my head is just, it's so next level and so cool that like I just gotta go over the top and showing you what I'm seeing, when the bottom line that Lovecraft understood is that nothing you come up with is ever going to be as dark as what's in someone's own soul, and you just give them the little pieces, the breadcrumbs for them to create what they need to create in their head. And to me, there's nobody that really gets that. I think I've watched one horror movie in the past 10 years, and every October I spend all October doing nothing but new horror movies for every day of the month. I did 101 days of horror a couple years ago. That was a little too much. 3 months of horror movies is too much. I could do October. I think The Ritual is the only one that I've ever seen that's a modern horror movie that you never quite see it. Like these little bits and hints of what you're, but like never enough for your mind to really grasp what's going on. And that's so important. How important it would to be? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, that The Ritual, I think, is probably the most recent movie I've seen that has gotten that Lovecraftian feel right. Um, and I've only ever seen, I think, one of his stories adapted that I liked, and it was The Strange Case of Dexter Ward, if I'm getting the title wrong. But the movie was called something else, and it had, what's his name, Chris Sarandon in it. And I remember watching that when I was in college. I'd come home on the weekend.
Is that the one that's the comedy?
Well, I don't remember it being a comedy, but the detective goes down into the basement where all of the experiments are, and he's got a lighter, and as he's lighting it, the monster keeps getting closer as the light's coming on. And I remember watching that with my dad, and both of us, when the light would come on, we would, ah, ah. When your dad's getting scared too, I was like, they're doing something right.
Chris Sarandon. There's got some memories of that guy. So you mentioned your dad a couple times. So is your dad someone who kind of started you down this path, or obviously if he had a big bucket of comic books that you discovered, I take it was a passion in the family?
Well, my mom was the avid reader. I mean, you never saw her without a book, but my dad's tastes are probably what shaped me, Westerns and sci-fi, the original Star Trek, you know, um, 2001 A Space Odyssey is one of the first movies I ever remember seeing. I remember when I was 4 years old seeing the first Star Wars at the drive-in, sitting in the bucket seat of my dad's van, next to him. And, that probably changed my worldview forever because, Star Wars as a 4-year-old, you're like, that's reality. And so it took a little while, to figure out that a wizard wasn't going to come and take me on an adventure. So, had to create my own.
That's always my favorite one, is when they compare the Star Wars to Harry Potter, and you realize, oh my God, J.K. Rowling did a 1-for-1 remake of Star Wars.
He did it without it being too much of a remake. I remember my wife wanted me to read Aragon, and I was like reading it, and I was like, why does this seem so familiar? And I got to a point in that line of Chris Rock's in one of the Jay and Silent Bob movies, because George Lucas is going to sue somebody for this. I was like, oh, this is Star Wars set in a fantasy setting, line for line.
Well, and the key is that, I mean, he straight up lifted the hero's journey as close as you could possibly come to writing the hero's journey out. So I mean, I guess in essence, he went so close to the archetype that like it's inevitable you're going to be following that archetype in the future. So, um, now I'm curious about how long have you been working in the industry doing what you do? Obviously, you've got a fair number of books that you mentioned. So,
Well, I guess in 2004, uh, I lost my job in the IRL world, and I was like, well, I've been a tabletop DM forever, and all this stuff. I'm going to sit down and write a novel. I did, and I had no clue what I was doing, and I sent it out, and I actually got two positive feedback from agents, and then I kind of put it on the shelf when I had to go back into the real world and get a job. Um, and then in 2015, I was able to sit back and actually start learning how to craft a story. Everybody kind of thinks that they know it, but there is a lot of work that goes into the craft of story building. Understanding the rising and falling action and plot points and pinch points and all of that stuff. And you know, you can sort of get it instinctively if you're around stories, but unless you understand and recognize the pacing of a story, you know, you're not always going to hit it. So in 2015 is when I really sat down and started doing the work of learning the craft. And in 2017, I pitched a novel to an agent and got representation that didn't really work out after he sat on it for a year and a half. And of course, and of course, I'm going in without any understanding of what's going on in the industry. So, in the wake of the sad puppies, I had no idea that I was going to wind up being, just by virtue of who I am, be on the outs with a lot of people. So after I started seeing the way things were going in the mainstream publishing industry, I started looking at smaller publishers and submitting short stories, and finally getting published that way. And that's basically what I've been doing. Is just I send out stories to open markets and building relationships with people, and it's just worked out that way.
I love I love when I hear that word because that to me that word is everything, and it's knowing the types of people that tend to go into this field and work on these types of stories. Relationships are the hard part because most of us are people that like to hang out in our books and comics and not spend a lot of time around people. Unfortunately, it is the making contact with people and building those relationships that is what makes this all kind of it's what makes it work. Like if you're not connecting with people, the bottom line is nobody's going to be reading your stuff. I also wanted to note, like, because you're talking about storycraft, and I know for me, it's really easy to like crank out a short story. You have a good concept, but when you take that short story and you try to develop it into like a real story, something that's not just kind of like a concise idea, when you really have to start, basically taking it for more than like a scene or two, that's when things start getting real next level and real complicated because making sure that the energy level, ups and downs, because you can't just be full tilt the whole way. Like, I mean, you could, I suppose, but if you did that for every story, it's going to be very one note. And it's that jump from short story to like novel, novella, longer form of short story. It's such a hard jump to make.
Yeah, there's a mechanics to both types of stories, and um, that's what I was saying. You have to understand the beats for each story, and
Is there a specific school of story that you adhere to, or do you kind of have like your own way of like constructing that at this point? Because I know I've looked at a number of books, a number of different like ways that people say, oh well, this is your 7 point system, or these are the you got your three arcs, and this is how it all works, and then you try and overlay any of them over the other ones. Like, okay, this kind of makes sense. Like, so there's 2 points that happen between all of these. I don't understand how to which one works.
well, the for novels, I uh, there's a book that I got that's over there. I'm trying to remember the name. Story Engineering by Larry Brooks. He lays it out perfectly as to the structure of how a novel should work. And I think, once I read that, it was kind of like the missing piece to writing a novel because I think the instinct is, when you've got this great setting and these great characters and your idea, you know where you want to go, you just take off. But you really, well, there's the pantsers and the plotters, and I'm a plotter. So it really worked for me to be able to lay out an outline. But when it comes to short stories, because I'm a pulp guy, I like the Lester Dent formula. And I mean, that one you could find on the internet anywhere. And, you know, he basically tells you how to write a good action mystery kind of story just by laying out the guidelines. But you can tweak that here and there once you understand the formula to be any kind of story. And, those are my two go tos.
I had someone actually send me the Lester Dent one for the first time into my Discord the other day, and I was like, "Wow, this is pretty genius. This dude broke it down to like even the word count." It was it's like if you follow this formula, you're gonna end up with a story one way or the other. Good or not, I can't tell you, but it's gonna be something.
I mean, it's definitely a skeleton that you can hang just about anything onto, or at least I haven't found anything yet that I like better. I'm not saying it's not out there, but I'm comfortable with it. And like I said, in fact, this week I was working on a story, and I had started with that, and I got about to the midpoint, and I just totally abandoned the outline and went my own direction. And I think it's one of those things where once you know the rules, you can break them, but until you understand them, it's not a good idea.
Well, and it's the breaking of the rules. The reason you need to do stuff like that, it's satisfying, is because there is a rule. It doesn't work if there isn't a rule that you're breaking. Whatever novelty is in there is in. Well, this is what I'm used to seeing, and it's interesting because I don't see that now.
And it's funny to me that rules are different across cultures. Like, we're pretty much familiar with traditional Western storytelling, but I've read some novels by Japanese authors, and their structures aren't necessarily the same. I mean, they're different. Like, one of my favorite novels is Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa, and it doesn't follow that hero's journey or the three act system that we're familiar with, but it's still a great story. So
Well, I mean, I know in film, like I love Japanese horror, and it is definitely not the same thing as American horror. Like for people who watched the movie The Ring and thought they were watching what that movie is supposed to be, you didn't. You really don't understand what that movie was about because it was a horrible butchering what they did to the original. Now, Ringu, it's called. Well, the big issue is that a lot of the symbolism that they kind of put in the Americanized version of it doesn't make any sense in America. Like if you plug it into the Japanese movie, like there's reasons that they chose those particular things, and it makes a whole ton of sense. But in the Americanized version, it's just kind of like random images that you're associating with this thing that like have deep meaning outside of what you're looking at, but you don't that part isn't culturally relevant, I guess, is part of the big thing. So, all right, well, I'm curious. You've been at this a while. What are the things that you have found are like the most powerful when it comes to finding and engaging an audience?
that's a good question. um, that's definitely the weak part of my game, to be sure. Honestly, I think just like you said, trying to make those connections, and probably the best thing for that is book signings, because if you're there at somebody, in their presence, and uh, I mean, you can do this at conventions, local libraries will sometimes have local authors events. Even, you could probably set up a thing at a flea market. But I mean, if you're there face to face and you can make the case for your book, that's probably going to be better than a billboard that somebody passes at 60 miles an hour. But maybe not.
Well, billboards mass marketing. And let's be honest, what we're doing, we're looking at niche marketing. We're trying to connect with a particular type of people. And to me, and you could probably speak more to this than even I could. Like in the past, like there was a place that we could all kind of go to, the comic book shop, the game shop, where you're going to connect with people that are kind of your people. But that industry, the comic book industry, has suffered so much over the past couple of years that there's fewer and fewer stores open. And so what used to be kind of like the outward, fan facing part of our culture has kind of, it's become harder and harder to find. Like I put it this way, I go to a comic shop that's an hour away because it's the one comic book shop I don't feel uncomfortable in when I go into. And it's got to make outreach more difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I haven't been in a comic book shop and I couldn't tell you the last time because um, I can't remember the last time I bought a comic book that wasn't crowdfunded. I mean, uh, that industry, and kind of the bad thing about it was that once comics stopped being on the spinner rack, the comic book shop did become that hub for our culture, the nerd culture. I mean, I remember in the 80s, you could go to Walden Books and they had a nice selection of, D&D books, and the fantasy section took up the back wall. So, I mean, you could meet people there, but uh, last time I was in,
My first D&D books were at an On Q, which is, a big chain record store. And they had like the one rack that was all their nerd stuff basically.
I don't know, I mean, the last time I went into the local Barnes and Noble, the science fiction fantasy now shares one rack. One side is science fiction, one side is fantasy, and that's it. I'm like, what happened? Last month, but I mean, it's all being taken over by manga now because that's what everybody wants to read. And hey, if they're telling great stories, great. I think maybe that's just a challenge we need to rise.
Well, and that's why the whole Iron Age media thing, that guy, when I first heard it, like that's why it resonated so much to me. Is one thing that I'm a marketer, and that's my thing. And the one thing that I've seen that I look at as being an overarching trend is nobody trusts anybody in power. And like big companies continue to do things that make people not trust big companies. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. And the thing that I find very interesting is that as this happens, you have this industry, or we'll just call it like nerd culture, is kind of finally done the thing that they needed to do, which was take the crap into their own hands and start making their own stuff. And the one thing that they have in that is that it's much easier to trust a person. It's much easier to connect with a person than a big company, because that's all, like all those brands and imprints from our childhood they're big companies. Stephen King is a big company. Like, yeah, he writes books, but they've been making jokes about him in Family Guy for 15, 20 years about, is he really writing books? What are these things you're pumping out here? So, you have that. You have, people, signing up to make a TV show off their most successful book series, and then not finishing the book series and taking advantage of the trust of people. And so the more as creatives that we can kind of give people an alternative that they can trust, I think the better off everyone's going to be. And I think that as consumers, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for people that can, accept our fandom and give us somebody that we can trust is going to be at least live honestly with that. Not try and undermine our expectations at every, turn. The bottom line is we like the kind of stuff we like the kind of stuff of. I don't need to have this genius rewriting of the entire concept of what a pulp story is. It's like, no, I like pulp stories because I like pulp stories. Just give me more of that.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to authenticity. People are going to respond and say, this person's a fan of this. They're not a tourist who's just showed up to take advantage of the hype that surrounds it. I'm one of those 50-year-old white kids that, saved my lunch money and mowed yards to make Star Wars, Marvel Comics, and Dungeons and Dragons what they are today. But now, those properties act like they don't want me. So, I guess that's the reason a lot of us are saying, all right, we'll make our own. We'll do it ourselves.
Well, to me, the thing is I guess I don't know from I guess because I understand what ESG is, I understand why the things that are happening with the industry is happening in the industry. But at the same time, like, who buys and spends billions of dollars to buy a fandom and then decides we don't like who that fandom is, so let's recreate it? Because it's just a bad business decision. Unless your actual goal was to undermine modern mythology, in which case you did a really good job of that. These stories that have been teaching people for generations are now no longer able to do that because nobody cares about them anymore. Congratulations. I guess we all just become Japanese.
Well, that could have been maybe the 14th story in my new book if I had thought about it. The reason that things are happening the way they are.
So why don't you tell people where they can get your new book and when that's going to be available?
Dark Owl Publishing is putting it out. It's a small publisher based in Arizona. And it's coming out June 16th, I believe. The trailer is on my YouTube channel, just Jason McCuiston on YouTube, or it's pinned on my Twitter, which is, I think, Jason J. McCuiston. So you can get a sense of what it's got in it. But yeah, June 16th is our release date.
Nice. And if people want to learn more about you outside of just this particular book, where can they go for that?
My Amazon page has got, I think, almost all of my publications, at least the ones that are in print. There were a few stories that were on websites. And the Dark Owl website actually has one of my stories on a podcast. Papa Redwood read one of my stories on his podcast, and Tales of Terror read another. I can't remember which episode, though.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jason. Hopefully somebody picked up something from this episode that's going to make life easier for them as they try and do what you're already doing. You have a good one.
I hope so. I greatly appreciate you having me on here.
Do you fancy yourself the next Tolkien, Lewis, or Barker? Maybe you just have something subversive to say. Hopefully this podcast is helping you. But maybe your ambitions are just a little bigger than you can handle on your own. Head over to ironagemarketing.com and let Nikki P help ensure your book doesn't release to nobody.